Great. Hi. Welcome to the third session of Animal Behavior. Today, the speaker is my colleague Scott Robinson, who is the Swisher Chair. No, the Ordway Chair. I'm sorry. The Ordway Chair of Ecosystem Conservation at the Florida Museum, and he's also in the Department of Biology. He received his undergraduate degree from Dartmouth College, and then went to Princeton and got a PhD there and working on the behavior of caciques, which are a bird. And then spent about 20 years at the University of Illinois, and then in 2003 came here to the University of Florida, taking up this endowed chair position. So, Scott, please.
Thank you. Is it on? Okay. It's not on. Is it now can you? Oh, okay. I'm also going to just yell. Okay. Yes. So thank you very much, Jane. This is a very great honor to, especially to be introduced by Jane, who is a very well-known animal behaviorist, as I'm sure you all know. She's in fact been on several of my graduate students' committees, and we have a thesis defense on Monday that has been long in the making, but but it's finally happened. So yeah, so this is very exciting. Now that what I'm, you still can't hear. Okay, how about now? All right. So you missed all those great preliminary. Oh, that's all right. The topic I'm going to talk about today is actually one of my favorite subjects in all of science because I'm going to be looking at a bunch of birds that are not closely related that spend most of their time together. Can you hear me? That they live together in closely knit little flocks. Now, in addition to being a scientist, I'm also a bird watcher. I'm a fanatical bird watcher. I have been since my dad taught me birds when I was really young. And one of the joys of bird watching is when you're wandering through a forest and you don't see much, and occasionally see a little bird flitting about, and then suddenly you're surrounded by birds and many different species, making lots of different calls, and you're running or you're trying to see as many as you can, and then suddenly they're all gone. This is a mixed species bird flock. Any one of you who've taken a walk in a forest anywhere in the world, pretty much, where there's forest, you've seen this before. And it's very exciting. It's really fun to see as many birds as you can, to try to identify all these birds. And then try to figure out why are they all living together? Because the old cliche is birds of a feather flock together. But in fact, while this is certainly true for lots of birds, and I'll talk a little bit about that early on, these mixed species flocks are really much more common, at least in a lot of different habitats, maybe not in wetlands and all. So there we are. Okay, now this is a monospecific flock of red-winged blackbirds. The red-winged blackbird is probably the most abundant bird in North America now. There's probably roughly 1 billion of them. And they used to occur in massive single species flocks. They still do this to some extent. But makes a lot of sense. These birds, they all eat the same thing. They're about the same size. They all have the same predators. Living together does make a certain amount of sense. Now, when I was a kid, you could see flocks of hundreds of thousands or maybe even 1 million blackbirds. Well, you don't see this anymore. I mean, these giant flocks have been selected against. They've been targeted because you can imagine these blackbirds eat grain and they eat corn. And so when they used to descend on some poor farmer's field, they could wipe out his entire crop or her entire crop. And this led to them to be massively controlled. The USDA actually went out and started doing quite a bit of control on them. And so now the flocks are smaller, they're more dispersed, but still it makes a certain amount of sense for these birds to stick together. If you actually look closely at that flock, those are mostly old males. So the female red-winged blackbirds also form flocks, but they largely with each other. These male and female red-wings are almost as if they were different species. Let's see, what did I do wrong? There we are. I'll hold it. Okay. Now, Some other birds that form these monospecific flocks that create problems are red-billed quelea. How many of you have ever heard of this bird? It's an African bird. This is the world's most abundant bird. There are many billions of them. They are major crop pests. For any of you who follow the news, if you really follow it carefully, I saw yesterday in the news that they are killing these by the tens of millions in Tanzania now because they're forming these big flocks and they're trying to eradicate this bird. Again, it's only a very localized problem, but these monospecific flocks are also really advantageous for dealing with what I consider to be the most important selective pressure favoring social behavior, at least in birds, which is predation. I don't know if you can see this very well. Do I have a, let's see, this is the green one. Is it? All right, well, I actually I have a microphone. I can point to it. These are, I'm sorry. These are flocks of starlings. Everywhere else in North America except in Florida, starlings are a plague. They're very abundant. And this bird flying at them right there is a peregrine falcon. And it is attacking these flocks of birds. And why do you, so these flocks are very obvious, okay? So the falcons know where they are, but why do you think they are, that these birds would be forming very tight flocks right before the falcon hits them? It's hard to pick out an individual. It's pretty diluted. Only one bird's going to get killed potentially. But how is it that this might provide protection for all of them? One of the thousands is part of it. But the peregrine falcon, I forgot to mention, is the world's fastest flying bird. They fly in a straight line at about 150 miles an hour, and they can dive like that at close to 300 miles an hour, depending on the measurement. But what would happen if all these birds form this very tight cluster? And this, yeah, if they hit these birds, they would break their wing. So they actually provide physical protection from each other because this falcon has to be very careful not to actually hit a massive flock of birds and crash into a bunch of them. So these sorts of behaviors, this is one of the, in Europe, they spend a lot of time watching these murmurations of starlings in the hopes that a hawk will attack them so they can see how they coordinate their movement. And it works really well. Falcons actually don't have that much success hunting starlings. Oops. Now, there are two birds that form monospecific flocks that again illustrate some of the problems with being in a monospecific flock. The Carolina parakeet and the passenger pigeon. These are two of the relatively few North American birds that are now extinct. The Carolina parakeet used to be right here in Gainesville, large numbers of them, used to be abundant. They are a crop pest. They would fly into orchards and eat apples, and the farmers would go out and shoot them. And unfortunately for them, they would come back and they're very social, intelligent birds, and they would try to figure what happened to their mates, and then the flock would get shot again. Passenger pigeon used to be the world's most abundant bird. They were, so North America's most abundant bird. Again, hundreds of millions, if not a billion of them. And they were hunted to extinction because they had to move around so much, just to avoid depleting the food resources. So again, these huge flocks of birds, sadly, they make these birds quite vulnerable to human-caused extinction in this rate. Okay, what did I do? I must be. Okay, so just some of the extremely basic conceptual underpinning of all this. Why join a flock? Why would you feed together? Foraging benefits are potentially there if they help you find food. If some individual birds know where food is and you're social, you can do that. Our bird feeder right now we're being inundated by common grackles. A single scout common grackle showed up at our bird. It's a black bird, a grackle. Showed up at our feeder 7 or 8 days ago, found lots of good food, and now there are 50 grackles probably feeding at the feeder right now. They're sharing information. So this is one possible benefit. There's anti-predator benefits, which we just talked about. what we have, the selfish herd, which is a bunch of birds that sort of dilute the effect of any one predator. You always put someone else out towards the edge, closer, more likely to be eaten, just safety in numbers. And then again, this information, in terms of finding mates and so on. There are some advantages, but the advantages are not automatic. Oops. Oh yeah, these are various social birds. This is the foraging, predation, and information. They can communicate with each other. Now, Katie Sieving is going to be talking next week here, and this is one of the things in which she's a global expert on, is communication of birds within flocks. So you'll have a chance to get into this. But the thing about living in any kind of group is the costs are universal. There are major costs to living together. There is increased competition for food. Remember, every single individual in that flock is the same species. They have the same niche. They have the same food demands. You have to have a lot of food. And they can deplete those food resources. Those giant flocks of blackbirds, you had to move around a lot. And again, that makes them fairly vulnerable. And of course, there's also increased disease transmission, which we've had vivid demonstration of over the last 4 or 5 years. The more social we are, the more likely you are to get all sorts of diseases. And the same species will have the same diseases, the same vectors, they're potentially sharing a lot of the same parasites. So there are automatic costs to living in groups. This is just the most fundamental basis of behavioral ecology, or of social animals. And one of the advantages of not living in a group of the same species is to live with other species. This sounds very simplistic, but in fact, this is something that I think most people sort of underemphasize. If you have a flocking system in which you have different species that hang out together, each one of these species has a different niche. These are forest birds from Amazonia. Well, I'll give you more details on how this works. But there are birds in the middle of this flock that actually help other birds escape predators. There are other birds that therefore can forage in more vulnerable places because there's someone looking out over their back. Some of these birds are searching for insects inside clusters of dead leaves. Some of them are just pulling insects off foliage. Some of them are on tree trunks. So every bird has a niche that makes them at least semi-compatible. So you can have all these advantages of living in a flock without the competition. And in fact, with other birds looking out for you. And I think this is the essence to this multi-species flocking, is that it means that you can live together over the long haul in fairly small areas, and you can achieve a level of social organization that is really quite incredible. This is one of the things that really interests me, this flock system, which was originally discovered by John Terborg, who was an emeritus professor living out at Cedar Key. He has to live somewhere else now while they rebuild his house. But he and Charlie Munn discovered a new level of flock organization that I'll go into in some detail later on, working in southeastern Peru. And some of my own graduate students at University of Florida have followed up and continued to study these same systems. And this level of complexity is a wonderful thing, because when you study a bird flock, you're studying behavioral interactions, aggression, cooperative interactions with predators. You're studying evolution of these various behaviors, and you're also studying ecology, because a very large number of the birds in these forests live in these flocks. And to understand how forest bird communities are organized, how they're structured, you have to follow these flocks. And these flocks are also, because some of them are so intricately structured, that they are potentially really vulnerable to human habitat modification, habitat loss, because you can break up these subtle, co-evolved, to use the jargon, interactions that they have. Okay, so what is a mixed species flock? Some of these are from my ornithology lectures, so I'm really sorry if this has a kind of a canned sound to it. But what is a mixed species flock? It's 2 or more species moving and foraging together. There are some mixed species flocks that have up to 70 or 80 species regularly occurring within them. More typically, it's 4, 5, or 6, maybe 10 species. They're mostly associated with forests, although they do occur in other habitats. There's a whole continuum of different kinds of flocking, from single species flocks all the way up to the monospecific flocks. They represent more complex and co-evolved behaviors. We'll go into that in some detail, and they're very important for community organization. Now, this is quite different. These temporary foraging aggregations in the bottom, these are mixed species groups. Here are great egrets and storks. You can see this right in town here. These birds are all feeding together, and sometimes they're even moving together, but these aren't really generally organized flocks. Personally, I think there are some mixed species flocks that occur in the wetlands, but as a general rule, it's a bunch of species or individuals responding to their own needs. Then you have ephemeral or daily flocks that might occur at roosts, such as shorebirds. If you go out to Cedar Key at high tide, you can see thousands of shorebirds all sleeping together. Then you have the temperate zone mixed species flocks organized around birds such as the Carolina chickadee and the tufted titmouse. And then you get to these tropical mixed species flocks that that are really quite amazing. I have to admit, I've studied flocks here in Gainesville, but these tropical flocks are pretty amazing. I want to apologize right now. There's nothing harder in the world to get a good photograph of than a mixed species flock in the forest. So some of the visuals here really are not good. I'm sorry. These are some of the world's most beautiful birds. I mean, these are swallow tanagers and masked tanagers and dacnyses and honey eaters and various tanagers. But they don't look so good when they're this little gray mass in here. So I'm sorry about that. I'll try to make up for the relatively modest visuals. Okay, so what is not a mixed flock? This is something I'm going to just make arbitrarily. They had to be moving together in search of food, but it did not include birds gathering at fruiting trees. Right now, if you have a fruiting tree in your yard, you can sit under it or look at it from the window of your place, and you can look out and you can see lots of birds, many different species, catbirds and thrushes and cardinals. And they're coming in there, but that's not a flock. That's just an aggregation. When you put out a bird feeder, lots of birds come in, but that's not a flock. Those are just birds coming to a point source of food. Your clay lakes, where parrots come in to eat clay, that's just an aggregation. Army ant swarms, if you work in the tropics, another one of the great joys of bird watching in the tropics is you'll start hearing these weird sounds in the understory. And then you move over there, and suddenly you look down, and there's this army ant swarm. And there are birds that are following, many different species of birds that are actually moving with the leading edge of the swarm, eating most of the insects and lizards that these army ants flush. The birds get more food than the army ants. And this is not really a flock. Well, I must admit, studies are just coming out now suggest that actually these army ant swarms are organized a lot in the same way. And then, of course, bird feeders, as I said. So again, fruiting trees, robins, cedar waxwings. These are two birds that will gather in huge numbers on campus shortly in the laurel cherries and in the I did it again. The birds at the mineral licks. These are all parrots coming in to eat clay to help digest tannins, and then the army ants. These birds that follow army ants, some of which are really quite phenomenally beautiful. This is the white-plumed antbird right here, which is for a bird watcher. This is something you really want to see. Okay, these mixed species flocks are found everywhere in the world. You got 2,000 species, 20% of the world's birds, 83% of them are pass range, which means songbirds. 184 species are red list, meaning they're endangered at some level. They're really well known in the neotropics. If you look for partly because of Charlie Munn and the Joan Turberg study here in this part of the world, everyone's been studying them in the tropics, following up on it. We still need more data on certain parts of the world, but still, these are a global phenomenon, so they're not restricted anywhere. So in some communities, 75% of the birds live in mixed species flocks. In fact, here in Gainesville, probably most of the forest birds you see spend at least part of the day in mixed species flocks. They are wonderfully conspicuous and easy to study. They're not easy to photograph, but boy, they're noisy, you can follow them. And they are hypothesized to be actually mutualistic. These species are helping each other. This mutualism is not a common sort of interaction. We scientists have tended to emphasize competitive interactions and predation. when we look at this. But these are fundamentally cooperative societies. At least this is one of the leading hypotheses. Now, this isn't necessarily always the case, and Katie will expand on that later. Which species flock? Again, these are boring slides, sorry, but small little birds tend to flock. There are some big bird flocks. Sometimes you'll see blue jays and big woodpeckers out there feeding together. They mostly are insect-eating birds, mostly in trees, and they tend to be species that are either not social or the birds that are territorial, birds that do not form single species flocks much. Okay, the benefits of this, a trade-off between foraging and vigilance. The more eyes you have in a flock, the better you're going to be at spotting predators. If you can't forage and be vigilant at the same time, actually you sort of can, but a few birds can. But if a bird is sticking its head in a cluster of leaves, it's vulnerable to predation. So this is just a fundamental cost. But in a mixed species flock, this vigilance is spread out among a bunch of different group members. So that means each individual spends less time looking for predators, so they have more time to forage. These birds forage at significantly higher rates in flocks than they do when they're foraging alone or in single species flocks. And these species have larger foraging niches. When they feel safe from predators, they don't have to hang out in tiny little dark places where predators can't find them. They can go out into the open because someone's watching their back. So they actually expand foraging niches by living in a group. This is something one of my students, Ari Martinez, has shown experimentally. Okay, finally we get to Gainesville winter flocks. This is a study that Harry Jones did. We have some of the best defined, some of the best structured flocks in the whole temperate zone, just here in the Gainesville area, which is all sort of borderline subtropics. These are all familiar birds. This is the ruby-crowned kinglet, which is a hyper-abundant little bird you tend to overlook, but they're noisy. The tufted titmouse, Katie's going to talk about them next week. White-eyed vireo is a regular flocker. Yellow-bellied sapsucker, see this very small sign here. They flock sometimes, but not that often. Yellow-throated warbler loves living in flocks. They're a palm tree-loving bird. The black and white warbler loves feeding in flocks. You rarely see this bird feeding outside of flocks. There's usually only one of these per flock. The blue-gray gnatcatcher up there, about 2 o'clock. The blue-headed vireo, the bird that catches insects on the trunks of trees. Carolina chickadee, downy woodpecker. There's the myrtle warbler, which is also called the yellow-rumped warbler. Orange-crowned warbler, pine warbler, red-bellied woodpecker. All of these birds in the winter will be found within 100 meters of the buildings here. These are all common birds. Almost every flock you see, at least sometimes, has all these birds in it. The size of this circle here indicates how frequent they are. Usually it's just 1 or 2 individuals per species per flock, except for kinglets and blue-gray gnatcatchers, which seem able to live in flocks. Actually, pine warblers to some extent too. When you go out bird watching in winter, this is what you're looking for. These are all really interesting birds. Some of them are year-round residents. Red-bellied woodpecker, tufted titmouse, blue-gray gnatcatcher, the chickadee, downy woodpecker. Some of these birds breed way up north. The orange-crowned warbler winters down here. Pine warbler, there's a few breed around here. Mostly they breed not that far north. Ruby-crowned kinglets nest way up to the north. White-eyed vireo, some are local, and so on. The black and white warbler. So this is a mixture of residents and wintering songbirds. Migratory birds right now, right in the very peak of the fall migration. A lot of migratory birds will also feed in these flocks. So if you're looking for migrant birds, find a flock. So constructing these kinds of networks like this is network analysis, which is something that was developed in communications theory. The people who study bird flocks have enthusiastically embraced. We quantify almost everything in these socialities by looking at network structure. And it's really quite an exciting thing that has given us a whole new set of tools to study this behavior. Now, Harry Jones here, who did his thesis in the down in Columbia, looking at the effects of fragmentation, he also studied these winter flocks here in Florida, partly when he was a Katie Sieving's master's student. Now, the advantages of being in temperate flocks, first of all, temperate flocks are seasonal. These birds don't hang out during the breeding season. They're led by titmice. I'll let Katie describe that. And they other birds form around these. They're intraspecific flocks of three to five titmice. They're joined by nuthatches. We don't have nuthatches here for reasons I don't understand. Woodpeckers, kinglets, creepers, and so on. They're fairly limited to 5 to 10 species, but these birds pretty much are always with the flocks. And the flock territory itself is determined by the nuclear species. In other words, everybody is following the titmice. These things are called nuclear species. These are essential keystone species that sometimes recruit flock members with specific calls, or they're just really abundant and other birds just naturally follow them. I'll let Katie describe the intricacies of how this system works. I didn't realize Katie was talking here next week, but Katie's done some incredibly innovative work on how these titmice are communicating with all of these other bird species and the extent to which all of these birds are eavesdropping on the titmice. They're listening to them communicate with each other about where the predators are, where the food is. And so everybody is benefiting from from this association. Everyone except possibly the titmice, but I'll let Katie talk about that. So these are really wonderful things. And again, you can see them. I mean, not quite yet, but in another couple of weeks, maybe in a month from now, you can walk the property here and see this flock. Virtually every bird in here. Okay, so these nuclear species, such as the titmouse, are called flock leaders. These have species whose behavior contributes to it. There are some that are active nuclear species that actually advertise. They try to recruit other species. Often, these are birds that benefit from the other birds, not just from predator protection, but also because they provide food. I'll describe that in a minute. There are also passive nuclear species that other birds just seek out. Maybe the titmouse. Titmice know everything, they're really smart birds. And so other birds that passing through here, hanging out with the titmice might be a good idea. Did it again. But then you have these sentinel species, which are vigilant birds that detect predators first. They produce alarm calls that are listened to by the entire flock. These sentinel species, the drongos in the Old World and antshrikes in the New World tropics. These are birds that have some wonderfully complicated behaviors because they are really helping the other birds very directly, but also exerting a cost. They actually they perch out in the open, potentially vulnerable, but they see the predators first because they're perched in the open. If a flying predator flies in, they can spot them, give alarm calls, and all the birds dive for cover. The other species are followers. They're associate species that join other nuclear species, non-joiners. They only sort of join the flock when it happens to be moving through, and they're a whole continuum of these birds. Cardinals sometimes feed in flocks, sometimes feed with other cardinals, sometimes feed by themselves. So none of this is necessarily fixed in the temperate zone. And these species join the flocks for different lengths of time. Now, there are some examples of flocks that make a whole lot of biological sense. I like to kind of emphasize these because there are some evolutionary issues that these flocks are so strongly selected for that you can sometimes get the evolution of plumage mimicry. This is a kind of a sort of a crude, but I like a drawing of pitahuis. Pitahui is a New Guinea bird, that bird in the upper left. And pitahuis are poisonous. This is actual Mullerian. Is it Mullerian or Batesian? I can't remember. When you're a tasty bird imitating a toxic. That's okay. They're Mullerian mimics, these other birds that are completely unrelated to the pitahui. They look a lot like them, and they flock with them. They share the same plumage, and they fool the predators just the way the viceroy fools the monarch butterfly, fools the predators of that don't eat monarchs because they're poisonous. And so this is a particular kind of mixed species flock that makes a lot of sense. It's, that you've evolved plumage to mimic a poisonous animal. This was discovered by someone who he caught one in a mist net, and for reasons he's never fully explained, he licked the bird's head, and his mouth started to draw, and pretty soon his mouth was paralyzed. Actually, there's a good reason you do this in the bird world, but we like to make fun of him for why he did this in the first place. But and when he discovered this as poisonous, this got a lot of attention. There's some other really interesting cases of mixed species associations, one of which we don't quite have here, but you all know the turkey vulture. When you're out bird watching or doing anything, you always see turkey vultures. It's very hard to stand anywhere in midday in Florida and not see at least 3 or 4 turkey vultures. They're ubiquitous, abundant year-round, and they're harmless, of course, for most birds. They're looking for carrion. They're looking for roadkill these days mostly. But you see that bird on the left there? That's called a zone-tailed hawk, which you can see looks a whole lot like a turkey vulture. It actually looks even more like it than you can tell here. They soar with the turkey vultures, look like a turkey vulture. Birds ignore them, and then suddenly they peel off and attack the prey. So this is a particular, again, this is none of these cases where these zone-tailed hawk has evolved appearance and behavior, and they even hold their wings up in a slight V, the way the turkey vulture does. And they use this to attack other prey. Now, the birds I studied for my dissertation in Amazonian Peru, they weren't fooled. They always knew that was a zone-tailed hawk, and whenever a zone-tailed hawk would try to sneak close by soaring with a turkey vulture, they would scream and dive for cover. But other birds apparently don't. And then there's something I'm studying now. I'm just throwing this out there now because this is something that Rebecca Kimball and I are really interested in following up on, which is the possibility that a lot of these mixed species flocks are actually evolving very close mimicry when there is nothing poisonous in these birds, when they're all feeding together. These are flocks from southeastern Brazil. There's the bird in the middle is a tanager, which the bird on the right is a common, it's called an oven bird, but it's a South American thing. And then Bicard on the left. These are completely unrelated birds that forage closely together, look exactly alike. And we think that a lot of these birds' appearances, a lot of the actual plumages that birds have are a direct result of selection favoring different kinds of flocks in different parts of their range. So we think this might be an important mechanism for generating new biodiversity too, for the evolution of new species. To put it mildly, this is a controversial assertion, but it is something that we think we have a lot of evidence for, and we are hoping we can get some funding to actually test these ideas. So this is just a little aside. Oh, and there's a very famous example of this too, the so-called helmeted woodpecker, which is right here. It was thought to be in the same genus as these two birds right here. I'm sorry, this is the helmeted woodpecker. Oops. It was thought to be in the same genus as this, and it was, assumed to be just another bird in this group. Well, it turns out this bird's closest relative is this bird here. This is a Celia's woodpecker. It's a very beautiful bird, and it's pretty clear that it has mimicking these two very big woodpeckers. This one here is a close relative of our pileated woodpecker or pileated woodpecker, which you see all the time, right in Gainesville. In the woodpecker world, the woodpeckers flock with other big woodpeckers seem to converge on their plumage because no predator wants to attack a bird like this, which is almost as big as the ivory-billed woodpecker, same genus, closely related, or the pileated woodpecker. These are dangerous birds to attack. A bird that spends its whole day pounding its bill into sharp bill into wood is not a bird that you're going to want to attack. And so we think that a lot of these little woodpeckers are mimicking these big, tough woodpeckers. For those of you, the few bird watchers, there's two birds called the greater and lesser yellowlegs, which are almost impossible to tell apart, except by voice or if they're standing next to each other. We always assumed they were closest relatives because they're not each other's closest relatives. In this case, the lesser yellowlegs is small, fairly quiet. The greater yellowlegs is one of those big, loud, annoying shorebirds that is always watching for predators. It's very hard to catch. And we think the lesser yellowlegs is imitating, it's converged in the same plumage as the greater yellowlegs, just to get this extra predator protection. Nobody wants to waste their time trying to catch a greater yellowlegs, which is always vigilant. It's always aware. Anyway, this is speculation. Sorry, but this is the kind of thing I'm very interested in. And then there's some other really. I said this is a really strange graph, but I'm going to show you. These are Chinese birds that are used to be considered to be in the Fulvetta. They were all thought to be in exactly the same genus. So all those birds on the right, they all form flocks together. They all look alike, act alike. It turns out that the birds on that page are actually in 3 different families, it's 5 different genera. They've all converged on the same plumage because they live in these flocks. And this just shows how confusing it is. If you just rely on what birds look like to decide who's most closely related, you're going to consistently be tricked by convergent evolution. And this is what we think is going. And again, we think, Rebecca and I think that this is a direct result of selection for mimicry in these mixed species flocks. And the bird you mimic varies geographically. Now, there, on the other hand, when you go up into the canopy of tropical forests, so this is one of the only pictures I have of spectacular birds. There are the canopy of birds that live out in the bright sunlight have almost the opposite pattern. These are birds that all live together in mixed species flocks in the Amazon basin where I did my thesis. And they all look really different. They're as different looking that they form mixed species flocks, and they seem to be under selection to be as different as possible, over dispersion in visual traits. And again, we think that in these well-lit, bright habitats, it might actually be good for birds that look different to associate. If you look different in the understory, if you're a white bird hanging out with a bunch of brown birds, the predators are likely to spot you. And whereas in the canopy with lots of light and lots of different light flecks, it might be that looking too much alike might have a different cost. Again, I'm speculating more, but this is a study we're engaged in right now. We're actually using artificial intelligence, machine learning to quantify bird plumages and to try to see if the birds that live together in the canopy are they're selected to look different from each other as opposed to look similar to each other. So, okay, I think that's the last of the wildly speculative stuff. All right, so now getting back to these tropical flocks. This is Ari Martinez, who is a graduate student who's now an assistant professor at University of California at Santa Cruz. He just got a good job, a really good job. Although as I understand it, living in Santa Cruz is impossible for anyone who's not some sort of tech magnate. But anyway, so Ari studies mixed species of bird flocks, again, in the different part of the Amazon from Cochacashu. The way my particular lab, as anyone who has worked with me and my students will know, my students are extremely independent. Ari chose his own thesis topic, his own study areas, and pretty much designed his own study. He and his committee interacted with him quite extensively, and he eventually wound up being co-advised, but it was he did a lot of work on these Amazonian mixed species flocks. I'm just going to talk about these again because they're so interesting, but they consist of 5 to 15 species, 1 pair per species. They forage together, they defend the same territory year round. They have, each species only protects as against the other. They have a sentinel to warn against predators. This was described a long time ago, more than 40 years ago. And the 2 birds in the bottom here, the ant shrike and an ant wren. This is an ant wren that spends all of its day poking at dead leaves, so very vulnerable to predators. This is the bird that watches its back, the bluish slate ant shrike. These tropical forests are filled with predators, as you can imagine. Not that this is a forest falcon, but it's about sort of the equivalent of a sharp-shinned hawk. Each one of these flocks defends its own territory. Oops. Oh yeah, this is Ari holding one of the sentinels here. This is actually the dusky-throated ant shrike, which does not have a particularly dusky throat, but all these birds are gray and it's hard to name them. And we do field work. We do massive field work. We go out, we census birds, but we also use mist nets to catch birds. So you can not only measure them and put bands on them, but you can also put color bands on them. Again, large field crews. This is already working in Bolivia at the time. So we put these individually recognizable color bands on the birds, so we can tell individuals apart. And we follow these birds for years, get their survival rate, who they determine. So with these individually marked birds, we can get highly detailed data on these birds. And this is one of these lovely network diagrams of one of these understory flocks. Again, you have the distinct canopy and understory flocks. There are about a quarter of the birds in that community participates in them. The understory flocks aren't quite as diverse, but again, one pair per species per flock led by antbirds, and the territories are stable over the decades. Ari went back to Charlie Munn's regional study areas, and the maps he drew of the territories of these understory flocks were almost identical to the same maps that were drawn in 1982 when we first started this study. So this is stability over 40 years, unchanging, presumably even with tree falls. So the way these things are organized is that way I've already talked about. You have these birds here that are perched in the open. They have a foraging niche, short legs, perched in the open. They look for flying insects. All these other birds are rummaging around on bark and foliage, poking their heads in leaves. And most insects, that's not a good thing for them to be eaten. So they try to escape. So these sentinel species that are perched in the open benefit from these birds because they flush insects. They're beaters. And these birds fly out and grab them. Now, these birds also chase them, of course, because they're adapted to chase insects that they flush. So this sets up a pretty negative dynamic where you have these birds are losing a fair amount of the food that they uncover, that they would catch to these sentinels. But on the other hand, they've got someone watching for predators. So there's this potential conflict in this system that is really quite interesting, and it gets particularly extreme. I did it again. Because when these sentinels are stressed, they use false alarm calls. They will, one of these little ant wrens, one of these little birds, one of these following birds, will flush a big katydid, which is like the best food you can get if you're an insect-eating bird in the understory of the tropics. And then this bird will give an alarm call. And then the other bird will stop chasing this big katydid, dive for cover, and then this thing will fly out and grab the katydid. And this happens a lot. This was very controversial. Charlie Munn published this almost 40 years ago, and no one believed him. I mean, it was just, birds aren't that smart. I'm sure that as you know, these birds are way smarter than we had ever thought. But this was actual deception. This is something that birds aren't supposed to be able to do. And then you wonder, well, how is it that they're continuously fooled? Well, the answer to that's pretty simple. You can lose a meal, or you can lose your life if if there actually is a predator. So there's this incredible asymmetry in the costs and benefits of losing a few prey items. And also, these guys are watching your back. They're enabling you to feed in places you couldn't feed, that you can spend more time foraging. So it's really very much like a feudal system, where you give a certain proportion of your food to the sentinel so they can protect you from predators. It's an interesting system, and it's been verified many times now. This has been shown over and over again by these skeptical people. There's this false alarm. You just didn't see the predator. How can you prove that? Well, it's still a hard thing to prove, but it is. I think it's now pretty much widely accepted, mostly because we know that birds are capable of even more sophisticated behavior than this. So it's not quite so hard to believe anymore. So again, this is, I guess, redundant with what we've already done. Now, the old world flocks that I've been studying more recently, I have a Chinese student named Wenyi Zhou, who I'm going to visit in a month. Now, I think University of Florida is going to let me go to China. I wasn't sure that was going to happen, but it looks like they are. The paleotropical flocks, primarily in Asia, are really fairly different because they are usually led by a very gregarious single species flocker. Often birds like babblers, laughing thrushes, if you know anything about Chinese birds. And there is a sentinel species, the drongo. It's a little bit hard to see this, but there'll be a flock of these babblers, sometimes 8 or 10, sometimes 20 of them, other birds following them. And then there's, in addition to all that, then you have this drongo. And drongos are especially interesting because they're kind of like the super sentinel. They're the ones who really depend on the flock. And some of them have very long tails, greater racquet-tailed drongos, and sometimes they mimic each other. It's really wonderfully complicated. But so this is a little bit different because you have a mixture of monospecific and multi-species flocking. And this is where we think that this is, you get the most of this. Did it again. Well, and these systems are particularly interesting because not only do a lot of birds follow these monospecific flocks, but you also have these drongos, the greater racquet-tailed drongo, which actually mimics the sound of all the birds it flocks with. In the early morning, these birds start singing mimetic songs, just like a mockingbird, in which they start all of the species they flock with, and they're basically signaling, they're telling them, come here, you come flock with me. And other birds do this, again, even though they lose quite a lot of food to them. And so these drongos are this kind of true sentinel sort of a nuclear species in all this. They give false alarms. They on perch, sometimes in the air. They're aggressive to other birds, and yet other birds still flock with them. Again, this is, I think, pretty strong proof, or at least strong indications that these birds are benefiting, from this anti-predator protection. So they attract heterospecifics, enable them to forage. They also do this false alarm calling. Now, as I mentioned a little bit, we're also, this being a conservation biology lab, we've long been intrigued by the hypothesis that these highly co-evolved species interactions are going to be extremely vulnerable to fragmentation and logging and other kinds of land use. Because you can break up these systems, you can lose, if you lose your sentinel species, or your nuclear species, you could lose the whole flock could go with it. And there's some evidence to suggest that this is going on. Habitat fragmentation, in which you create small forest patches and create edge habitat, an isolated habitat, where you have this hostile matrix surrounded the remaining forest patches. This is an extremely common problem. It limits dispersal, and it also leads to the secondary degradation as people come in and start logging. So you break down these forest patches. It'd be very easy to imagine that these flocks would break up. And Harry Jones, we've done a lot of work in this in South America in the Andean flocks. In this case, this is in the Western Andes of Colombia, which, if you're a bird watcher, is one of the world's great places. You look at these isolated forest patches and see how the flock structure changes in these various forests. You look at the edge effects to see if they void edges, go inside them, the isolation, and then you look at all these other various costs, such as more predators. So that slides outboard. These Andean flocks are really quite interesting. And when we started this study, we didn't really know something that is now fairly widely understood, which is that these flocks, this is nearly all the birds in the Andes feed in flocks. These are all, every bird on this page is a regular participant in mixed species flocks. The bigger ones tend to hang out with the bigger ones. These are migratory songbirds that breed up in North America, the winter down there, that also, this is Blackburnian warbler. There's a northern, well, actually it's tropical parula, but this is a bird closely related to our northern parula, which is literally everywhere around here. Black and white warbler, which you saw in the flocks, Canada warbler, worm-eating warbler. Actually, that's Basiloudris. But anyway, our migratory birds hang out with these flocks in winter, so they're potentially important. And these flocks tend to be dominated by tanagers, some of which are really quite spectacularly beautiful, often led by these relatively less spectacular bush tanagers. There are often many different tropical flycatchers, wood creepers across the top. This is, these are really interesting flocks down in the tropics. But these Andean flocks, it's the same thing. When you're bird watching the Andes, you look for flocks because this is where you're going to see all your birds. And these are great looking birds. I mean, these are fun birds to find. And so, so this is really kind of a big deal. We've always been very concerned that these Andean flocks would be very sensitive to fragmentation. Again, so there's, those brown birds tend to flock together. These flycatchers, many of which have these ear patches, tend to flock together. This next size up, these birds all flock together. The migrants flock together, and so on. So one of the things we did find when you go from the forest interior to open forest generalists, these little small fragments do lose a lot of the birds that they have. you lose a lot of species, you lose the nuclear species. This graph is kind of hard, but you look at flocking propensity. The fragmented habitats tend to have birds that are only loose flockers, but they keep some of them. The forest interior birds do differently. And when you look at these flocking networks, I'm sorry, these are these graphs that take a huge amount of work to generate. But you look at the network inside forest, they're very big, lots of species, lots of connections, very tightly structured. You go into the younger forest or a smaller fragment, you lose some things, you change a lot of species, but you still have them. Then you go out into the shrublands and out into the really disturbed habitats, the flocks are a lot less diverse. So some of these worst case scenarios have been largely confounded. So when you go in these really disturbed areas, you get fewer species, reduced flock stability, reduced number of flocks, less connectiveness, reduced flocking propensity, all these different things. So there is some breakdown of these flocks. Let's skip that. But one of the pleasant surprises, and I think Katie will back me on this, is that the flocks don't disappear. You can still see mixed species flocks in really disturbed areas. It may not be the same species necessarily, but forest species often will cross gaps, more likely to cross a gap when they're with a flock because they've got other birds helping them spot predators. Then the presence of these nuclear species, the ones that remain, make the species braver, and they actually can increase forest use. So the flocking remains the same. The species aren't the same, but you find flocks in virtually all of these habitats. So this behavior may actually be, rather than necessarily something that makes them hypersensitive to fragmentation, it may actually be one of these behaviors that has enabled birds to adapt to the changing conditions of these altered landscapes. Okay, that's it. Thanks. I forgot my summary slides. Sorry. Summarized flocks are great. Okay.
Okay. Any questions? Okay.
Do you know if this behavior is learned and passed down from generation to generation, or is it instinctual and evolved in terms of DNA?
I don't think that that's been looked at. I would guess that certainly there's a lot of learning involved because a lot of these birds, especially in the Andes, are very facultative. But I think the tendency to hang out with other species would probably have at least some kind of inherited component to it. But no, I don't think we've done the actual work on what the genes are. This is one of the, now that we've got, some of my students are sequencing whole genomes now, and we might be able to look at that, answer that question more realistically someday. Some of this propensity, like the drongos, it's got to be genetic because that's what they do. The fact that they mimic means that they do that.
Do fish flock the same reasons that birds do?
Yeah, they do actually. Yeah, there's been some really good work done on fish. I'll let Jane can probably tell you more about that than I can. But the oddity effect was originally documented in fish. When you put in a fish that doesn't match the other ones in color, it's the first one that's nailed by predators. And so yeah, the fish schooling, there are definitely multi-species groupings of fish that are moderately well studied. I mean, they're not quite as perfectly orderly and structured as the bird flocks are. These birds live together their whole lives in one little territory, but there's a lot of the same selection factors.
Coral reef.
Pardon?
Like on a coral reef.
Yeah, so yeah, coral reef, thanks, yeah.
We have a question here, Scott.
But
Yeah. Scott, thanks for this information. It's fascinating. I'm wondering, and this is similar to your question about the fish, but since there's so many benefits to multi-species flocks, have you observed, besides the fish, other groupings, other multi-species groups that pick up on a lot of these advantages, and then taking it to another level, in the evolution of man, has this practice ever been noticed between man and other animals that he hung out with?
Well, yeah, it's kind of that's an interesting observation. We have a dog in here. I have several dogs at my house. There's certainly that's a multi-species. The dogs are very good at manipulating humans to orient our whole lives around taking care of them, and cats are even better, I understand. Um, uh, yeah, this is I mean, marine mammals show this behavior. There's some insects like ants. I think there's some ants that form multi-species groupings. Uh, what, probably yeah, primates. My God, yeah, John Terborg, my thesis advisor, documented this strongly in primates, and capuchin monkeys and tamarin monkeys and squirrel monkeys all feed together quite closely. So yeah, I think these advantages are pretty well defined. In humans, we don't know from a sort of deep evolutionary time. We had several species of humans that apparently coexisted. Didn't work out that well for the Neanderthals. Thank you, the Neanderthals. But it was so it's kind of I'm not really sure that the genetics of this is one of these really tricky questions. I've never actually been asked that question because it's one of those things that we simply we just we don't really know that much about it. But the human thing is really quite interesting because it's very easy to see the human association. You go up in the Tibetan plateau and you see those Tibetan giant dogs, are they mastiffs or no? Yeah, that are defending the cattle and the yaks and all that, and it's really fairly easy to imagine this being an anti-predator. Yeah, I tend to believe that predation is the dominant factor. Other people think as well it's they help each other find food, but the reason they help each other find, that they hang out together is because they don't want to be eaten, um, and 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 that I think is really the leading pressure. So,
My question is, I thought you said somewhere early on that they don't flock like this when it's breeding season.
yeah.
So how do they stay safe? How do they eat? How do they do all of that?
That's a great. When birds are breeding, especially these Amazonian birds, life is miserable. When that sentinel bird, that antshrike that guards, when they're breeding, they have to stay near their nest. And sometimes the flock will feed near the nest, but eventually the flock will consume all the food near there, and they have to move away. And these birds have to shift and catch their own food, and it's very awkward. It's really hard. Now, a lot of these other birds that breed on territories, they migrate up to places where food's really abundant, and they stay in dense cover if there are predators around, and they just they're able to do that. But in winter, when food's often scarcer, often diminishing, the predation is often worse. There's less cover, for at least for around here. They're that much more vulnerable. So during the breeding season, they spread out. They defend territories in pairs. They stay in dense cover, or they just live in places where there's so much food they can get their food pretty easily, even if they're very inconspicuous. But then in winter, they have this option because they're no longer tied to the nest. Being stuck to the nest is called a central place constraint in the jargon. Really changes everything because you have to commute. You have to incubate at that nest. You have to guard that nest from predators. And then for the several weeks your nestlings are growing, you have to carry food to it. So you can't get that far from your nest. So forming a mixed species flock during the breeding season would be very, very difficult. But on the other hand, one of my Chinese students tells me that he thinks that there is actual breeding season flocking in some of the birds in southwestern China that he's been looking at. So there may be some birds that modify where they put their nests so that they can still form flocks. And that's if that's true, that's something new, which is of course exactly what you want a grad student to find, something new that will help them break out of the pack. So.
I had a question. Thank you, Scott.
Yeah.
That was interesting. I had a question about the research that was done by I guess it was your former student who went back to where John Terborg and Charlie Mann had done that original research in the late 70s, was it? Or?
Yeah, 81.
And you said that the network was pretty much the same. Is that because the habitat hadn't really changed, and if it was pretty much the same, if there were any changes, what were they and why?
But there were a couple changes. The bamboo I don't know if you know anything about bamboo, but a lot of birds are specialized in bamboo. And the bamboo, every 40 years, seeds and dies out. And since in between the two census periods, the bamboo seeded and died out. So the bamboo birds did disappear. The ones that were dependent on, form flocks, but only where there's bamboo. So there was some vegetation structure change. Otherwise, the vegetation structure changes in the sense of a lot of tree falls. And, this is in a floodplain, so during flood season, water flows through this and knocks down a lot of big trees, but it's still floodplain, beautiful floodplain forest. So there were changes, but not radical changes. And so we think from the flock's point of view, wasn't really anything all that different. This is, I actually think that this is the leading example of community stability in the entire bird world. These are communities, these Amazonian bird communities, they just don't change that much, at least in the floodplain. Unfortunately, in the terra firma, other studies in the middle of the Amazon on drier forest, they are showing really large-scale declines of all birds, including species that form flocks. Betty Loisel and John Blake, who are in the Faculty of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation, they've in the Ecuadorian, Amazonian forests that their bird populations are crashing, and nowhere near people. I mean, they're absolutely, 500 miles from the nearest settlement of any size. And this is, so there are some really ominous signs out there. But at least in this particular floodplain forest, when we went back and redid this, everything was almost identical. There were one or two fewer canopy flocks, but they're unstable anyway. So.
Do you pick up different personalities in flocks? I saw one day a two-species group. It was royal tern and gulls, and they were just like relaxing on the beach. They weren't feeding particularly. And there was one tern that would go up to another and sort of jabber at it, and then that one that was being jabbered at moved away because maybe he was bored. And so the same tern went to another bird and did that. They did it 3 times while I was watching.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, do they notice personalities, or is there a leader, or what?
There are personalities. One of Katie Sieving's students, actually, I've forgotten, Ping Hua, she studied personalities of tufted titmice. And she, of various birds, yes, individual birds have personalities, and different species have very different personalities. They're really, so personality is a very big issue. And it's a really interesting issue because there are costs and benefits of bold and shy personalities. And there are some species of birds that are very, they call them neophobic, afraid of new things. Others are neophilic, they're attracted to new things. And each one of these is associated with a whole suite of other traits for where they forage, how they forage, how big their range is, how much they migrate. So personality is a huge issue in all this, and individual variation. I could have been a young royal tern that's just being irritating because that's what young birds are. And I'm sorry.
Thank you.
So.
Okay, I think it's about time to, or actually past time, to, if you have further questions, perhaps you can come up and talk with Scott for a few minutes. And as you can tell, next week is Katie Sieving, who's going to be talking with us about one of our local species in much more detail, the tufted titmouse. Okay, thanks very much, Scott. Really appreciate it.